Hello class, and welcome to week 3, module 3 of juvenile justice. This week we're talking about measurement of crime. Remember that every generation views children as becoming more violent and dangerous, like we talked about last week with the juveniles and super predators, than the children in the previous generations. These data sources are largely of 3 types that we're going to talk about: official data, victim data, and self-reported data. The official data on juvenile delinquency includes data collected from government agencies that handle delinquency cases, such as law enforcement agencies, juvenile courts, and correctional institutions. Because not all juveniles who engage in delinquency end up in the juvenile justice system, official data may not reflect the actual number of delinquents in any given year. Official data can reflect instead maybe the juvenile justice system's handling of youthful offenders, provide valuable information regarding law enforcement agencies and the juvenile justice system's handling of the delinquency and status offenses. The 3 major types of official data are NIBRS, SRS, and juvenile court data. The participation in the Uniform Crime Report, or the UCR program, is voluntary, and the percentage of the total population covered in the UCR program has been increasing and reached almost 98% of the total population in 2015. The FBI provides a uniform definition on 28 offenses and a handbook to explain how to classify and count these offenses. 4 sub-programs as the Summary Reporting System, or the SRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, or NIBRS, Law Enforcement Officers Killed and Assaulted, which is the LEOKA program, and Hate Crime Statistics programs, all of which produce an annual report. The traditional SRS system, often referred to as the UCR, collects 2 major types of data, and that's the offenses that are known to law enforcement and persons arrested. Data on offenses known to law enforcement are collected on 8 offenses. The data on persons arrested are collected on 20 additional offenses. The SRS also collects the clearance rate for the 8 offenses from offenses known to law enforcement. The SRS program considers all children who are under the age of 18 years old as juveniles, irrespective of the state's definition of juvenile. The program has amassed almost 9 decades worth of U.S. crime data. Some of the strengths: the SRS can describe a trend or a change over time in the number of offenses known to law enforcement and those persons arrested. Only a program that attempts to collect census data on all offenses known to law enforcement and persons arrested. One of the limitations: delinquency data relies on the arrest data because the age of offender is unknown for the data on offenses known to law enforcement. This underestimates the number of actual offending because only a small number of individuals who break a law are ever arrested. So again, we're looking at only those persons that are arrested. Victimless crimes, which are offenses involving the victim, such as rape and domestic violence. Many victims do not even report their victimization, thus escaping the attention of law enforcement. Therefore, it's not a valid statistic. The hierarchy rule, when determining arrest data and counts only the most serious offense committed by a person who is arrested for multiple offenses. It may include inaccurate data that are reported by participating law enforcement agencies, some of which are mistakes and others are possibly intentional, by downgrading crimes to less serious offenses. So classifying offending to gang-related, to get a federal funding and of substantiating or discouraging crime reports to law enforcement. So many of this official data is not the most reliable when you're really looking at the true number of offenses or the true number of victims. The next type of official data is NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. It's developed in 1988 to address the limitations of the traditional SRS data that we just talked about, and to improve the detail, the amount, and the quality of national crime data. There are 7 major differences. For instance, NIBRS collects data on 32 offenses, 22 Group A offenses, and 10 Group B. They're based on incidents rather than offense, arrest, or offense clearance. There's a greater amount of detail for each of these incidents. NIBRS counts multiple offenses for each incident. NIBRS distinguishes between attempted and completed offenses for the Group A offenses. NIBRS collects victim-offender relationship information on all crimes against person, offenses, and robbery. NIBRS collects data on suspected drug use during or prior to an engagement in another crime on which arrest occurred. NIBRS collects basic demographic information on all those involved in the incident, victims, offenders, and the arrestees. Also, NIBRS program by law enforcement agencies is still low, with less than 40%. That's 6,648 out of over 18,000 of law enforcement agencies that participated in the SRS contributed data in 2015. So it's not we're not getting as much as we would with the NIBRS, but I mean with the UCR, but the NIBRS is much more reliable. We also suffer from the dark figure of crime problem. Make sure you know that definition. The Children's Bureau of the U.S. Department of Labor began collecting information on cases that are processed by juvenile courts in 1926 and started publishing Juvenile Court Statistics Report. This is a really good report, and if you are interested in it, you can actually access it on the internet. It started publishing the reports. It collects both aggregated and individual case data. The data is collected from each state. It's not uniform, so it does not include basic demographic information on the juvenile, but offense charge, referral date, characteristics of processing, and the disposition. The National Juvenile Court Data Archive holds over 15 million cases. The strengths of this data: it has 15 million cases, as I mentioned, which allows for examination of the trend over time, attempts to collect census data on all cases processed by the juvenile courts. Limitations of the data: it's a change in method of collecting data, making it hard to compare the years, and it only accounts for juveniles that make it to the court system. The National Crime Victimization Survey is a national survey on the victimization of crime. It's collected annually by the United States Census Bureau since 1972. The NCVS collects individual victimization data on personal crimes. For each victimization incident, the NCVS collects information on the type of crime, whether or not is it attempted or completed, the type of victimization, monetary loss or physical injury. You'll have to excuse that little barking. We have a new puppy who's trying to intimidate the older female lab here. So let's see. As I said, the monetary loss or physical injury, characteristics of the victim and the perpetrator, including age, sex, and race, and victim-offender relationship, and whether or not victimization incidents were reported to law enforcement. The NCVS was created with 4 specific purposes. Make sure you understand these. To develop detailed information about the victims and consequences of crime. To estimate the number and types. Oops, I am so sorry. I went too far, didn't I? So let me go back to I was talking about the 4 specific purposes. To develop detailed information about the victims and consequences of crime. To estimate the number and types of crimes not reported to the police. To provide uniform measures of selected types of crime. And 4th, to permit year-to-year comparisons. The strengths of the NCVS. The NCVS attempts to I'm sorry. It attempts to shed light on the unreported crimes, which is the dark figure of crime. There's your definition. That do not come to the attention of law enforcement by collecting information from victims of crime rather than the law enforcement agencies. The NCVS also collects more detailed information on each incident of crime than the traditional SRS program does. It allows for the examination of the trend in victimization over long periods of time, almost over 50 years. Allows for the estimation of the extent of criminal victimization in any given year for the population as a whole and for subgroups based on, our characteristics, our sex, age, race, and the location of the residents. Let me correct that. Based on sex, age, race, and the location of residence of the offender. Along with the strengths, we know we're going to have to look at the limitations of the NCVS. There are several. There were concerns over the validity and reliability of the survey questions and measuring consistency of what they are supposed to measure. And remember, that's important when anytime you're looking at reliability and validity, that it's measuring exactly what it's supposed to do. Another difficulty with self-reported surveys like this one is the telescoping effect and other recall bias. Which the telescoping effect refers to the tendency to incorrectly perceive the timeline of past events. Questions of honesty in answering interview questions, especially on sensitive victimization experiences like rape and domestic violence, particularly if the victim knows the perpetrator and a family member is the perpetrator. There are some good surveys on this type of collection where the surveys are sent out to certain locales, and of course they remain anonymous. And so, there's no really recollection of who's sending it in, and that helps protect their identities. NCVS also is limited when it comes to examining delinquency offending because victims often do not know the exact age of the perpetrator to determine if they were victimized by children under the age of 18. So they're basically guessing, were you victimized by someone under 18, unless they specifically know. And this could add to validity issues, because if they answer yes and they really don't know, then we always, but remember, in statistics, which I'm not going over here, we always account for that measure of error. The NCVS is also limited with respect to victimization among juveniles, because children who are under the age of 12 are usually excluded from the survey. NCVS excludes individuals. Oops. I did it again. It excludes individuals who are homeless or institutionalized, because they obviously are not going to get the survey, in correctional institutions, and others living in less stable housing. And the reason I'll tell you that I make errors like that is I'm using two computers as we talk. So I have all my notes that are available to you within the PowerPoint, but I have them on another computer, and so that I can reference those. Here we go. Self-report data is obtained by asking juveniles to report on their delinquency of offending through an interview or a questionnaire. It allows for the inclusion of questions that are not about delinquency that the other data sources do not include. This is important, and you need to recognize this for explaining the etology of delinquency. An example, the information on education, socioeconomic status of parents, relationship with parents, friends delinquency. These surveys on delinquency, like the NCBS, attempts to shed light on the dark figure of crime. Remember what that is. Self-report surveys discussed in this chapter are based on a nationally representative sample of juveniles. The National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, which is the NLSY, is part of a larger study that's called the National Longitudinal Surveys. Imagine that. The NLS, which is sponsored by the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics, and is conducted by the Center for Human Resource Research, which is the CHRR, at the Ohio State University. NLS has added 4 additional longitudinal studies that are funded by numerous different agencies and are continued to collect data. The National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, which is the NLSY79 study, has been collecting data since 1979, annually until 1994, and biannually since then. This longitudinal survey covers ages 0 through 14, and the NLSY79 young adults covers ages 15 and up. These studies have been collecting data since '86. The NLSY97 study has been conducting data since '97 from a nationally representative sample of 8,984 children who were between the ages of 12 and 18 at the initial interview. So when you say initial interview, that's how old they are when it started. So they could be older as the interviews, as the collection continues. Cross-sectional data. Make sure you know what that is. You don't have to understand that really now for this information, but it's always nice to know what cross-sectional data is. It's collected from a group at one point in time, and the longitudinal data is collected from the same group over an extended period of time. The longitudinal surveys are rare because of the difficulty in collecting such data. Obviously, it's time-consuming. Obviously, you can lose participants. It's valuable, though, in determining time order of events and establishing causal relationships. NLSY97 collects information on delinquency offending using a delinquency index, arrest and incarceration history, and the use and abuse of alcohol, tobacco, and various different illicit drugs and legal drugs. The NLSY studies allow for the longitudinal examination, remember that's over time, of delinquency of 4 different cohorts, and the intergenerational transmission of delinquency over 2 generations. Finally, these studies I'm sorry, I hit my other tablet and lose my notes. Finally, the NSC studies oversample minority groups, including blacks and Hispanics and Latinos, and this allows for the focused examination of trend and extent in delinquency across these groups. Other types of self-report data include the National Youth Survey Family Study that began in '76 by the Institute of Behavioral Science at the University of Colorado. The NYSFS is a longitudinal survey over time that has followed the original respondents into their 40s until 2004, and a total of 12 waves of data has been collected for the 27-year time period for the longitudinal survey. The NYSFS examines changes in attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors related to delinquency and drug use. The index of delinquent behaviors used by this survey has been replicated and used in subsequent self-reported studies. Monitoring the Future, which is the MTF project, annually since '75 collects data on drug use among young people, in addition to the cross-sectional data, which is at one time collected from these age groups. The MTF has also been collecting longitudinal data biannually from a representative sample of each of the 12th grade sample of students at 76 until they turn age 55. The school-based survey given to students' classrooms, the longitudinal data are collected via questionnaires that are sent by mail. It's limited to just one type of delinquent behavior, which is drug use. It has detailed and extensive data on the following 4 issues: lifetime, past 12-month, and the last 30 days use, drug use, the perceived risk of using, the level of disapproval of the use, and the perceived availability. The Use Risk Behavior Surveillance System, which is the YRBSS, don't you just love all these acronyms, has been conducted biannually since 1990. It tracks health risk behaviors and their consequences, such as death and disability among young people. Health risk behaviors examined include law-breaking behaviors in terms of both victimization and offending. This survey is a school-based survey that encompasses both national and local surveys involving representative samples of 9th through 12th graders. The limited data source on delinquency, it's because of its focus on health behaviors among young people. So it's not looking at any more, it's very specific. The limitations of these 2 surveys, of the MTF and the YRBSS, they're focused on minor delinquency and status offenses, and the exclusion of those not attending school, so those that are homeschooled or out of school for any other reason. It's an absence of serious offenders. The way questions were asked and the use of the response categories. Some of the strengths, it's a redesign over time and inclusion of serious and chronic offenders, so it's corrected some of those limitations. It was redesigned over time. Oh, I'm sorry, read the same thing. It's more accurate than the UCR because they uncover information on the dark figure of crime. The juvenile justice policy moving away from tough on crime approach. 50% decrease in arrest nationwide for juveniles since 2005. The arrest rates for those under the age of 18 are at a historic low. Arrest rates for those under the age of, let me read that again. Arrest rates for those under the age of 18 are at a historic low. If you want me to hear it again, it's right here on your PowerPoint. The arrest peaked in 1996 and then decreased rapidly since. Juvenile courts have handled almost 1 million delinquency cases in 2014, which is a decrease since 1997 of 46%. Over 80% of the cases were referred to the juvenile court by law enforcement. And remember, just because they're referred doesn't mean that they're adjudicated or even charged. A majority, 83% of the cases involved high school age adolescents that were at least 14 years old, with 16 and 17-year-olds accounting for nearly half of all cases. It was actually 48% of all cases. Since 97, delinquency adjudication decreased for property and violent offenses. And of course, if you look at these, I want you to pay attention, which is important this week, to pay attention to these dates and compare them to last week. Because remember what we talked about, that the super predator was in the 80s and 90s, but yet we have a decrease in delinquency. The only thing that did go up was robbery. 3 times as many cases, they handled 3 times as many cases as they did in the 1960s. There was a decrease in overall delinquency, which had little impact on the disproportionate involvement of minorities in the system. And remember, it's the same thing with the what we talked about with the super predator and tough on crime, that delinquency was actually going down in the 90s, but yet the public was being fueled by the media to increase punishment. Black youth commit more person offenses. White and other minority youths commit more property offenses. There's a disparity between the white and black youthful drug offenders has become smaller over the past decade, and the number of female delinquency cases handled by the juvenile courts in 2013 increased 19% over 20 years. Female delinquents disproportionately involved in some offenses like larceny, simple assault, liquor law cases, and disorderly conduct. There was disproportionate involvement in delinquency for black girls. Now, here are some charts that show you the trends that we were just talking about. So take a minute and pause and look over this slide. This also is listed in your textbooks. In 2013, the juvenile courts processed nearly 150,000 status offenses. This was a small increase since the 90s. Law enforcement agencies were responsible for 60% of the status offense referrals, which is an increase of 6% since 2001. Females make up 43% of status offense cases that are processed by the courts. In 8% of the status offense cases that the juvenile court sees, the adolescent was placed outside the home into locked juvenile court facilities. Now that's for status offenses. I want you to make sure and understand, not understand, but take heed to what I just said. And remembering what the status offenses are, those are offenses that a juvenile commits that are not a crime if committed by adult. So there are things like truancy and runaway, and that 8% of status offense cases that are handled by the juvenile courts. These are the cases handled, and I reiterate on these wordings because we're not talking about 8% that were arrested, those detained, or 8% of those that were committed, but we're talking about 8% that were actually handled by the courts. These juveniles were placed into a locked down juvenile court facility. Most delinquency adjudication results in a formal probation supervision and, for some, an out-of-home placement. In 2013, person and public order cases were more likely ordered to some type of residential placement. While property and drug offenses cases were more likely ordered to formal probation supervision. I want to make sure you understand about residential placement. What you will read in your textbook and what you will read in articles about residential placement, you know, it's not a prison, it's not detention, but let me give you an example. When I conducted my dissertation, and I did a meta-analysis, so I did it on, I was looking at incarceration by juveniles. Hold on just a second. So in my research, I was comparing recidivism following incarceration and following other placements, as in community and less intensive as incarceration. Well, and I want to say in the state of Florida, and those that were considered and labeled residential placements were actually locked down facilities where they did not have, where they were locked into their individual rooms as well as locked into their residence halls. But that was just the term they used for incarceration. So I just want you to be very careful when we're looking at the different labels for these sanctions. And it's all in how they define it. And that's another thing that's very important, especially in criminal justice, is you make sure and understand what is being defined here and who's defining it. That's why whenever you do your thesis or a major research project, you do need to make sure, and this is all talking about conceptualization that we talk about in research studies, that you have to make sure and properly defined your variables and properly defined that which you're identifying. From those that I just mentioned in 2013 about the cases that were ordered to some kind of residential placement, from this population, 70,000 are confined on any given day to detention centers, to residential facilities or state correctional facilities. The placement numbers involving juvenile offenders has declined by half since 1999 and across all major delinquency offense types that preceded placement. Okay, so across all major delinquency offenses types before that preceded placement, of those confined in 2010, 89% of those had a prior conviction and were adjudicated delinquent prior to the current court order. So they had been confined, so they had recidivated. So 89% of those that were incarcerated had recidivated. These offense percentages have changed little over the past 2 decades. So if we look at that over the last 2 decades, so what about our Get Tough policies in the 90s? If they haven't reduced, then our Get Tough policies didn't even work. Detention is idly utilized for safety reasons only, to protect the youthful offenders and or the community, either as a pre-trial holding, so in order to determine the adjudication of the adolescent, and or post-trial sentencing purposes for either both low-level and more serious offenses. They could also be being held before transfer. Detention centers also serve as the point of intake and initial detention after adolescents are arrested by law enforcement. If you ever get a chance to go to your local detention center, I really recommend doing that. Even just calling them and seeing if you can get a visit, or even just ask if you can come in and view the grounds. The use of detention centers have shifted since the mid-1990s to include holding nonviolent offenders. The rate of juveniles that are held in detention centers declined since 2001. Serious offenses, which are those placed in public facilities, and males average longer stays. Males and black youth were more likely to be detained. And before you jump at that, is that a disparity? We need to know what's the rate of offending for all gender and races in order to compare this. Otherwise, you could get a false reading. Again, here's some more graphs and some more of your tables that show what we just talked about. And sometimes it's easier to see it here. And so I do again suggest, please take a minute to look at this. Of the juveniles that are in our correctional facilities, there's 38,000 that are confined on any given day. And I don't have those books in front of me, or I would be reading them to you, but where all this data is collected, I'll put those on the website so you can get a chance, and we mentioned them a little while ago, that you can look all this up and you can see how are these divided, and exactly on where the rise and fall and what's impacting that. There's an average of 3 to 12 months of confinement, decrease in youthful offenders placed after delinquency adjudication. Youthful offenders are transferred to adult court is not available. This is something that is lacking tremendously, and I have tried. I've done a lot of research on waivers to adult court, and I've tried to collect my own data, and it's almost impossible, because as I mentioned earlier, what happens once a juvenile is waived to adult court, he is now considered an adult in the criminal justice system, and so it's no longer looking for a juvenile in the criminal justice system. So to find those that have been waived, or even let's just say transferred to adult court, once that occurs, like I said, from that time on, once they're waived there, they're waived for everything. There will always be seen, tried in adult court. Race and gender impacts the concerns within the juvenile court populations. We just talked about this. Race is a significant predictor of detention placement and incarceration outcomes, but it's also a significant predictor of recidivism and the rate of offending. Minority youth are more likely to be detained. Also, they're more likely minority youth will further penetrate juvenile justice system. As I said, the disproportionate minority contact or confinement. The minority youth in confinement are confined for much longer periods of time. There's an increase between incarcerated white and black offenders. The gender differences between these, females now are actually more likely than male offenders to be held in detention for certain offenses. May be reflected in the changes in law enforcement policies or a decrease in public tolerance for juvenile crime. Female crime has constantly increased, as well as female juvenile crime, but this is impacted by a number of things. First of all, that the system is no longer looking at women as in quotations, the weaker sex. That, you know, many times when a woman would commit a crime or would be in court approaching the judge, if they had a family or children, the judge would release them because they were needed in the home, and so therefore they were receiving lighter sentences, as well as many times they weren't even adjudicated because they're a girl, and girls aren't as violent as boys. I'm being sarcastic. So anyway, that's why we're seeing an increase in juvenile offending, not necessarily because they're offending more, but they're being handled by the juvenile justice system more severely and more equally to their counterparts.